Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How serious are the reverses Russia has suffered in Ukraine? Is its response in terms of mobilization, as well as the threat of using tactical nuclear weapons, a bluff or desperation? And how should we view India's response to recent developments in Ukraine? Those are three critical issues that I should raise today with someone who's considered one of India's foremost strategic experts, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Manoj Joshi. Mr. Joshi joins us from York in the United Kingdom. Manoj Joshi, let's start with the reverses Russia has recently suffered in Ukraine. Last week, it was forced to retreat from Lyman, a significant military hub in Donetsk. This week, a Ukrainian tank offensive has advanced dozens of kilometers down the Dnipro River in Kherson. As a result, the BBC says that 226 days after the war started, Russia actually holds less territory in Ukraine than it did in the first week. So my first question is, how serious a setback for Russia is this?
I think it's a pretty severe setback, considering when you look at the beginning of the whole thing, February 24th, the Russians thought that it was kind of there'd be a kind of a coup de main, and they would just capture Kiev, they would overthrow the government, Ukraine would surrender. And from that point, we've seen this remarkable turnaround where Ukraine has, in a sense, discovered its nationhood and is fighting. And not only is it fighting, it's fighting and winning, meaning its offensives in the eastern and southern areas display a pretty high level of military art. And they also indicate the usefulness of the kind of weaponry that they have received from the West. But we should not overestimate that. Believe it or not, a large amount of the weaponry that they are using is one which is now being captured from Russia. So the Russians aren't they're simply unbalanced, and they have now decided to raise new forces. But it's going to take time to raise those new forces. But in that period, the Ukrainians could advance further. So they are in a bit of a dilemma.
Let's analyze the advances that we've just mentioned. According to Reuters, the recapture of Lyman gives Ukraine an opportunity to advance deep into Luhansk. Apparently, Lyman is in fact a gateway into Luhansk, whilst the advance down the Dnipro River apparently threatens Russian supply lines and could affect 25,000 troops. Now, if Reuters is correct in that analysis, how worrying is this from Putin's point of view?
Well, Putin doesn't seem to have straightforward answers. The Russian military machine, which we all thought was a huge and impressive military machine, has simply come apart in a certain way. Meaning what we've seen of Lyman is that the Russians melted away, meaning some of their top class units came apart. And so that the measure of the defeat is not that they didn't stand and fight. In the south also, the Russians had put some of their best units there, and now they have been overwhelmed in some cases. And also in the south, the Ukrainians are poised to recapture the one provincial capital they lost, which was Kherson. They're, I think, pretty close. They are not giving much information, but they're pretty close to that point. And so, as I said, the Russians don't seem to have answers. Meaning, yes, as I noted, they've started their mobilization and all that. But you can't take raw forces and pitch them into the front, because if you do that, they will just get massacred. So you got to train them. But if you got to train them, then you don't have the time to stop the Ukrainians who are on the march.
I'll come to the Russian response in a moment's time. Let me first put to you some of the measures that have already happened in terms of changes in command, as well as admissions by the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman. Now, this is a gentleman called Igor Konashenkov, and he has said, and I'm quoting him, with numerically superior tank units, the enemy managed to forge deep into our defenses. That's a clear admission by the Russians, even though otherwise they try and deny that there's actually been an advance. But this is a clear admission there has been. And then Reuters says that Putin has sacked Colonel General Alexander Zuravlyov, the commander of the Western Military District. Would you say these are clear signs that Moscow is worried, no matter what sort of brave front it tries to put on?
Well, one is that when they say superior tank units, they're not really accurate. The Ukrainians are fighting with more or less the same equipment as the Russians, the same T-64, T-72s, tanks. Secondly, it's not a tank battle, meaning if we think that this is like Rommel going through the Western desert, it's not like that. It's a more complicated battle. And that is the whole point why students of warfare need to look at this carefully. The Russians have been outclassed, as I said. What the Ukrainians did was to attack on multiple lines. And they attacked on multiple lines. And number two, these attacks were perfect combined arms operations, meaning they had tanks, artillery, and infantry all working together. Now, this is what the Russians didn't do. Meaning, in the case of Kiev, right in the beginning, they just simply lined up out there, and they thought that their special forces will capture Hostomel airport outside Kiev and overwhelm the Ukrainians. So here what we are seeing is a kind of a textbook version of how to fight these battles. And the key is not just the tank, it's a combination. Well, I can go ahead later, but please.
I was going to say, the fact that Putin has sacked Colonel General Alexander Zuravlyov, and the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov is now admitting to reverses, even though he's attributing them wrongly to superior tanks, but he's admitting the reverses, those must be indications that Russia is worried.
Well, absolutely. Meaning the Ukrainians even captured a brand new T-90 tank, which has probably been stripped and taken to the US to study the tank. The point with the Russians is they don't seem to have an answer. Meaning at this point, whatever commanders, mind you, these are kind of probably the second, third wave of commanders that have come there, meaning a whole lot of them have been sacked earlier also. So plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D of the Russians have all failed. And now they don't seem to have a plan.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. Let's then, at that point, when plan A, plan B, plan C, and D of the Russians seems to have failed, talk about the responses that are being put in place now. First, Putin has ordered the mobilization of up to 300,000 reservists, but Reuters reports this is mired in chaos. Reuters says tens of thousands of Russian men have been called up, whilst a similar number have fled abroad. In fact, Kazakhstan actually claims that 200,000 Russians have crossed the border into Kazakhstan. So do you get the feeling that far from being a solution, this mobilization is going to add to Putin's problems?
Well, why didn't Putin do this right at the outset? Why did Putin, euphemistically call this a special military operation? Because he didn't want to give the Russian public the notion that he was disrupting their lives by a war. So he called it a special military operation. But now, what are the Russians confronting? They're confronting a warlike situation where they're being mobilized. So yes, there is huge resistance to this. And it's not just Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, even Finland, the Caucasian republics have received hundreds of thousands of young Russian men who are fleeing this war. More important, this mobilization, as I pointed out to you earlier, this mobilization requires these troops to be trained. And it would take them 7 to 8 months to train them, to be able to send them, if they are to be effective on the front. But in those 7 to 8 months, which we are talking of now, the winter and the spring of 2023, the Ukrainians could push further and further. There's nothing to stop them as of now. So the Russians are in a dilemma. So on one hand, they're just dumping some of these people into the front. On the other hand, they are finding it they are themselves unable to train them. And also, there's one other more important point, Karan, that the Russians have lost a lot of their non-commissioned officers who actually would be the trainers. The experienced non-commissioned officers, they were already sent to the front earlier, and many of them have been killed or have been wounded. And so they don't even have an effective training system which can take advantage of this mobilization.
Now, the second element of Russia's present response is to annex Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Although Putin doesn't control all of these 4 districts, I presume his intention is to declare these Russian territory, which in fact he's now done because he signed the actual legislation bringing it into force. And thereafter, I presume he will claim that Ukraine is now invading Russia. Will that strengthen Putin's position, or will it in fact add to and strengthen Ukraine's resolve?
Well, it'll very clearly, the Ukrainians are ignoring that annexation bit. The annexation simply lacks credibility. Meaning, it's one thing to have annexed those areas when the Russians were winning, or they had said, we have won and we have annexed these. It's quite another thing when they're actually down on the ground under pressure from Ukrainian forces. Those very areas which they claim to have annexed, they can't control. And so there is a lack of credibility. And I think that lack of credibility also comes across by the fact that even in countries like Serbia, which is a very strong ally of the Russians, have not recognized, they've criticized it. And Turkey has criticized it. So which means they don't have support, even from their own allies. I think North Korea is the only one which probably has supported this annexation, but none of the other countries have. I mean, say, on Monday, we will have a UN General Assembly session, which is going to discuss this. And let's see how the votes fall out there.
Now, the third response is to threaten the use of tactical nuclear weapons if Ukraine doesn't withdraw from what Russia now considers its territory. In your eyes, is this bluff, or is it in fact a sign of desperation?
Well, I think it's both. It is bluff and desperation. But since the Russians have something like 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, we must take it seriously. And I think the Americans have privately issued warnings that the Americans will simply have no alternative but to react. They will react. Now, whether they react with a counter-nuclear strike or whether they react with a devastating non-nuclear strike, we don't know. But the point is that Putin, who's already sort of gambled and lost, in my opinion, will find himself in even deeper trouble if he actually uses nuclear weapons, even tactically. He might find the NATO at war with Russia at that point.
And if that were to happen, does Putin stand a chance?
Not a chance at all. He can't. He's finding it difficult to cope with Ukraine. So I don't think he would be able to handle a NATO response to a nuclear strike. And I think some of that has been spelled out. People say that the NATO could wipe out all the Russian forces in Ukraine. So they wouldn't cross into Russia. They would attack forces using conventional air power in Ukraine, and they would sink the Black Sea fleet of the Russians. And one other point I want to make to you: even now, the Russians, despite their huge air force, etc., have not been able to establish air superiority over Ukraine. So where are they going to take on the NATO?
So in the light of all that we've discussed, what is your assessment of the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine? Can you answer that with reference specifically to the leadership of the Russian army, its strategy, and the effectiveness of its weaponry?
Well, I think that the leadership of the Russian army, the Russians themselves have responded, meaning the repeated changes of commanders have brought out the fact that there is a problem with their leadership. They have sacked so many people. As far as the strategy is concerned, it's highly questionable. As I said, they started with Plan A, which was a kind of a coup de main to capture Kiev. Then they attacked the Kharkiv area. And earlier they had attacked the Kherson area. Then they went to Plan B, then to Plan C. And right now, as I indicated earlier, they don't have a plan. You see, as far as the weaponry is concerned, I think the weaponry is, as good as the man behind it, the motivation and the morale of the man behind it. And as I pointed out to you earlier, a lot of the weaponry is similar to the one that the Ukrainians are using. So it's the weaponry is not the issue here. The issue here is the tactical, the tactics of the Russians, how they've been led, how they're organized, how how their leadership has failed them.
Way back in March, that's actually 6 months ago, The Economist made the following comment. It said, Russia's initial slow progress in Ukraine is prompting NATO to reassess its adversaries' capabilities. Now, 6 months later, has that opinion both been strengthened and strongly corroborated?
See, NATO is sitting pretty. Already. It has got the addition of two very important countries, Sweden and Finland. And the Russian front against the NATO has increased by something like 1,400 kilometers. And both Sweden and Finland are countries that have pretty high level of defense spending and expenditure, while the rest of NATO has been lax, and the Americans have been doing most of the spending. But here we have two potent countries which have joined NATO. And also NATO itself as an alliance has been strengthened in the last 6 months. And that is all due to Russia, meaning the Russians complain that NATO is their threat. All they have ended up doing is to make that threat more potent.
And the other thing the Russians have done is to downgrade the image of their own fighting force in NATO eyes. Now NATO doesn't take the Russian threat anywhere near as seriously as it did earlier on.
Well, I would still say, but Russia is a very large country. It's capable, as we've seen in Ukraine, of visiting large amount of destruction and death, in its borders. Some of the NATO countries are very small, meaning, let's say, the Baltic republics. So they definitely would not want to tangle with Russia just for the heck of it.
Okay.
Meaning they're very, what should I say? Their existential threshold is very, very low.
What about public opinion within Russia? We know that the mobilization is not popular. Hundreds of thousands have literally fled across the borders to escape mobilization. Reuters, in addition, is reporting that talk show hosts in Russia are now acknowledging setbacks and searching for scapegoats. Once again, from Putin's point of view, this is not a very happy outcome.
Well, this should be worrying. Reports of, draft refugees in the Central Asian Republic, Finland, Georgia, indicate very little support for the war. I mean, we are not seeing kind of a rah-rah thing, which I don't know whether Putin actually expected that. But, when a country is at war, you do expect that. But the fact that it's not there, and the fact that there is criticism, and, Putin's control of the media in Russia is not total. It's not like what the Chinese run. So we do have indication through the Telegram channel or through other bloggers and other Russians that there is significant opposition has built up to the war. And as I said, large numbers of young people who should be fighting have voted with their feet.
Quite right.
So one doesn't have to.
They've literally left the country.
Yes.
Let's, before we end, come to India's response to recent developments in the Ukraine. After repeatedly saying, including at the UN itself, that we support the UN Charter, what do you make of India's decision to abstain at the Security Council when Russia's referenda and annexation of Ukrainian territory were being voted upon?
I think this is a geopolitical calculation. And mind you, it's not only India which has abstained, it's China, Brazil, and Gabon. So we leave aside China, which had a special relationship with Russia, but look at Brazil and India, two large countries but separated by continents, and yet they saw it fit to abstain on this. Now, as I said, the real challenge will be to see how the UNGA votes. If the UN General Assembly, if there is an overwhelming vote against Russia, I think India will look. There will be a slight embarrassment for India, because in the previous instance, the UN the ordinary members, by and large, kind of abstained or didn't really support the Ukrainian and Western position. So now the Monday meeting should clarify some things.
So if India, in your opinion, abstains at the General Assembly level, then that could be an embarrassing moment for the country.
Well, if that, I'm here, sort of being trying to be fair about this. That is, if that vote is overwhelmingly against Russia, and then we are caught on the wrong side.
Now, you're speaking to us from the United Kingdom. The West was full of praise when Mr. Modi at Samarkand told Putin that the era of war is over. This is not an era for war. Are they now having second thoughts after India's stand over the referenda and annexation? Has that disappointed them?
I think they have understood by now that India has certain compulsions. I think External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has, one is the oil part of it. Even they are now confronted with this oil conundrum, which is with this OPEC plus decision. So we in India, we're completely, we don't have any oil of our own. And if we didn't have the Russian connection, prices would go through the ceiling. So I think our compulsions are there. And of course, everyone knows very well our compulsions with regard to the way our security forces are equipped, largely with Russian origin equipment, which is dependent on Russian spares. But I do think that this particular war is going to accelerate the trend with which India kind of moves away from Russia when it comes to buying weapons.
But your bottom line is that India's abstention over the resolution regarding Russia's annexation, and that referendum that was held, that has not worried people too much. They've accepted it and they've understood it.
Yes, because as I said, that other countries, China, as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, China, Brazil, and others, the vote was 10-1.
Okay.
One was the Russians themselves. So I don't think it's really. I don't read too much criticism out here.
Now, should India, a country that is committed to opposing the use of nuclear weapons, but also committed to the threat of using nuclear weapons, given both of those, which are our traditional positions, should we have condemned Putin's threat to use them? Shyam Saran, in an article that he wrote for the Tribune, I believe yesterday, believes that we made a mistake. We should have condemned it. What's your opinion? Would the Russians have accepted us condemning it? Would it have enhanced our stature if we had?
Definitely, I think we should have condemned it. Nuclear weapons are just simply too serious, and nuclear threats are too serious to ignore. Meaning you cannot, and we know very well, for example, our neighbor Pakistan, which has often made it very clear that they would have no hesitation in using tactical nuclear weapons against India. And as far as India is concerned, we have given a no first use pledge, but Pakistan doesn't give any such pledge. Meaning they could use tactical nuclear weapons in situations which may not be, we don't know, because they have not clarified as to in what circumstances they would use nuclear weapons. Okay, so the threat of use of nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons is a taboo which should not be broken.
So quite clearly, India should have condemned Russia making statements that they don't rule out the use of nuclear weapons. That is something we should have condemned. We shouldn't have shied away from.
Absolutely. I think, we should have drawn the line, in my opinion, we should have drawn the line when a member of the United Nations was attacked by another member of the United Nations.
So right at the outset, you're saying, when in February, on the 24th, yes, when Russia invaded a sovereign country, we should have been critical about that, not silent.
Absolutely. Because if you don't have the UN, then you have a free-for-all. Meaning, and this was a very basic thing. Beyond that, the Russians had given special commitments in the Budapest memorandum. When the Ukrainians had surrendered their nuclear weapons, the Russians had assured Ukraine of security within the existing borders, meaning this is all laid out in the Budapest memorandum. So the Russians are the one who, in my opinion, who have displayed bad faith.
If anything, therefore, what you're saying is that the Budapest memorandum makes it even more important for India to have criticized the invasion, because not only was the invasion morally wrong, it was a clear breach of established international law, which is something we always support. So it was another big mistake, you're saying.
It was a big mistake, but as I said, that we are also, one is, what we say, rule of law, etc. The second is geopolitics. So the question is, how finely should we have walked the geopolitical line? So I can understand abstentions at strategic intervals, etc. But definitely, I think the question that you started out with, when it came to nuclear weapons, there's no question of being trying to fudge the issue. We should have been outright in our condemnation.
Finally, on Tuesday, just 48 hours ago, Prime Minister Modi spoke with President Zelensky, and he told him there can be no military solution. Now, that's a very interesting position, and I want to question it. Does that, in your eyes, suggest that Mr. Modi thinks Putin will give up Ukrainian territory which he's seized by invasion? Or does Mr. Modi expect Zelensky to give up Ukraine's claim to territory that Russia has now seized from Ukraine? Which of the two?
Well, this is the big problem. And I think, leave aside everything else, when it comes to ending the war, unless one of the two sides alters its minimal position, that we won't concede more than this. Unless one of the two sides does it, we don't see an end. This will continue.
But the problem with telling the party that's been invaded that there cannot be a military solution is, in effect, you're saying to the party that's invaded, please accept what you've lost.
A lot of people in India, and a lot of people, I think even Europe, have been basically trying to put across to the Ukrainians that, let's have a ceasefire. So this is the model of Kashmir, where there was a ceasefire, and so there's now Azad Kashmir, and there's the Indian Kashmir. And so throw this up to the UN, and we'll see later what will happen. But I don't think it works in this particular context. I think the issues, everyone pointed out, most, intense war that we have seen in recent times since the Iran-Iraq war of 1980 and 1988. And so there's a huge amount of destruction, suffering, transformation. Ukraine itself has been transformed. So I think it's very difficult for them, particularly for the Ukrainians, to accept that we will concede this point, and the Russians can occupy what they have occupied in the past, and especially when the Ukrainians are now winning.
Absolutely. That is the paradox of the advice Mr. Modi has given. Precisely when the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back and are fired up with whatever limited success they've had, we end up saying to them, this is not a time to look for a military solution. And the corollary of not looking for a military solution seems to be, I underline the word seems to be, you must learn to live with the loss that you've already suffered?
Well, I suppose he is transposing advice that that we ought to give ourselves on Ladakh or what? I'm not sure. But is he trying to hint that India is willing to live with what's happened in Ladakh?
That's a very interesting way of seeing it, because, of course, Mr. Modi and the government don't acknowledge that China has trespassed onto Indian land. But everyone else believes that is the case. And if the advice given to the Ukrainians is applied on ourselves, it would mean accept what's happened, don't look for a military solution. And certainly, if Pakistan were to occupy further parts of Kashmir, we would not say to the world, there's no military solution. We would be desperate for one to push them back. And therefore, it occurs to me that it's a strange thing to say to the invaded party. I can understand this being said to Putin, because the corollary would be, and you must now withdraw. But to say it to the invaded party feels to me as if it's a little insensitive.
I think Modi is trying to finesse this thing, but he's not. Instead of finessing it, he's creating more problems, because he had made that statement that this is not the era of war to Putin. So he's trying to balance this with this statement to Zelensky. But I think that India is in some ways running out of time, because when this happened in February 24th, I think the Indians thought, the Indian ministers and others thought that this will be over quickly and we can then get on with the world. But this is not getting over quickly, and it's getting more and more complicated, meaning as of now, let's be very clear, the war is nowhere near ending. The war is nowhere near ending. The consequences of the war are still emerging. For example, the whole oil, the OPEC business. So we are still going to live with the consequence. And I think at some point, our good friends in the West, the United States and others are going to say, look, what's with these Indians? You know, because wars are classic situations where it's a you versus me situation. And so sitting in the sidelines is not easy. And people don't appreciate.
One last question, and I'll ask you for a quick answer. Do you believe that Mr. Modi and India can play a role in negotiating peace between the Russians and the Ukrainians, or do you think that's a little bit too much to expect?
Well, my point is very simple. My point is, at least they should have tried. Meaning, we are supposed to be this leader of this non-aligned countries. We have been considered a major power, Vishwaguru, whatever you want to call it. But surely, at some point or the other, we could have made a public announcement calling on the two sides to do A, B, C, or having done some diplomacy before that, of course. You know, I'm not saying you just make a simple statement.
Is it too late to try now, 6 months after 9 months, forgive me, after the war started?
It's not too late, provided you think it through. My point is, I don't think the government's policy, I don't think they've thought it through. I don't think they anticipated, for example, the way things would unfold. No one anticipated, Frank. I don't blame them on that. But the point is, they should think through.
Even these latest comments made first to Putin in Samarkand, then now to Zelensky over the phone, you think they're not properly thought through? You think these are impromptu conversations, not well thought through strategies?
No, I think the comment to Putin in Samarkand was definitely aimed at the West.
And it worked. What about the conversation with Zelensky?
So that's the point I'm trying to make. But they should be interconnected, meaning if you're going to take a position with Ukraine on one side, Russia on the other side, you see, then you've got to understand that how you're going to mesh it together, how you're going to mesh it with your global outlook.
And that's not happening.
And that's not happening, or it's not visible.
Manoj Joshi, thank you very much for making time for us.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.